Welcome, everyone, for coming here tonight. We want to be thankful that All Souls has allowed us this forum. All Souls is a very wide, diverse community of persons that explore many options, many things about, beliefs and views and so forth. I am Henry Stover. I am a member of All Souls, and I'm also co-chair of Peaceworks. The restrooms are down this hallway, a good little ways, and you will see signs in the hallway. If you need anything, come and ask me because I'm familiar with the building. If there's anything odd, suspicious going on that you have questions about, just let me know. I'll be sitting near the front here, but tonight, Margot Patterson will do the introduction of Nicholas Davies, who's co author of the book War in Ukraine Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. So let us welcome Margot.
I'm Margot Patterson with Code Peak, Kansas City, and it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Nicholas Davies, an independent journalist and a researcher with Code Pink. His work has appeared in Salon, Common Dreams, Truth Out, Counterpunch. Oops, we do. Do we need this? Well, maybe we do. Yes, definitely. Okay. And many other news sites. Uh, as you know, he's the author with Medea Benjamin of War in Ukraine, as well as an earlier book, Blood on Our Hands: The American Invasion and Destruction of Iraq. I finished uh, War in Ukraine last night, and I can tell you, you'll probably learn more from reading just a few pages of his book than you will have learned in the last 9 or 10 months. It's informative and readable and offers much needed context to a complicated conflict.
I'm gonna take this. Okay, thank you, Margot. So, um, what we're going to do here is start with this 20-minute video presentation narrated by Medea, and then after that, we'll just open it up to discussion, questions and answers, and hopefully all have a good time together. So, um, let's see. That wasn't supposed to happen. Um, Give me a minute. I think yeah, this is actually set up at like the 9th minute instead of at the beginning. Yes. Okay.
Let's talk about the heartbreaking war in Ukraine and what we could do to try to end it. Every day the war rages on. Civilians and soldiers are being killed. Millions of Ukrainians have been forced to flee and seek asylum in foreign lands. Schools, hospitals, apartment buildings, and infrastructure have been reduced to rubble. We wrote this book to try to help people make sense of a war should never have happened. A war that has raged on for months and might well rage on for years. A war that could lead to a nuclear confrontation. A war that must be stopped. We know that people have very different opinions about this conflict, and we hope that our book and this talk will foster respectful dialogue. We have not tried to justify or excuse Russia's invasion of Ukraine because we do not think it is justifiable or excusable. We hope we can help you understand the context, the background, and the actions of all the parties that led to this crisis. As U.S. citizens, we have very little hope of influencing the Russian government, but we should be able to influence our own government, which is why it's so important to look at the role the United States has played in fomenting the conflict. Let's look at two elements of U.S. involvement that we highlight in our books: NATO expansion and the events of 2014. Western leaders call NATO a defensive military alliance, but NATO was formed to defend Western Europe from invasion by the Soviet Union. That mission was accomplished when the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991. NATO should have been dissolved at the end of the Cold War, along with the Warsaw Pact, which was NATO's counterpart in the Eastern Bloc. Instead, NATO reinvented itself to justify its continued existence. It expanded all the way to Russia's borders, despite many promises that it would not do so, and ignoring warnings from experienced U.S. and Western diplomats that this would lead to a predictable yet entirely avoidable crisis with Russia, as in fact it has. You can see the map showing the various waves of expansion in which NATO incorporated former Soviet republics and Russia's European neighbors. In 2018, the antagonism reached new heights when NATO, under U.S. pressure, publicly promised membership to the former Soviet republics of Ukraine and Georgia. While no definite date was set, NATO began supplying increased levels of military aid and training to Ukraine, including Ukraine in military exercises. So Russia certainly had legitimate concerns about Ukraine's involvement in an ever-expanding military alliance that was encircling Russia with powerful military forces and had already unleashed aggressive wars and occupations in Kosovo in 1999, Afghanistan in 2001, and Libya and Syria in 2011. The other event that served to set the stage for the Russian invasion in 2022 was the coup in Ukraine in 2014. The 2014 upheavals began with massive peaceful protests against the corrupt pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych. Unfortunately, though, these protests turned violent and were co-opted by neo-Nazi groups that refused to go along with an internationally negotiated plan for a political transition, and instead they spearheaded a coup. The extent of U.S. support and involvement in this coup is still shrouded in secrecy, as are previous U.S.-backed coups in Iran, Chile, and many other countries. But a leaked audio tape of Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt exposed their roles as coup managers as they handpicked what positions each of their Ukrainian collaborators would assume in the post-coup government. Although the original peaceful protests in Ukraine were about wanting to join the European Union, Nuland dismissed the European Union's more popular choice for Prime Minister, Vitaly Klitschko, with her infamous F the EU remark. According to a Gallup poll conducted in April 2014, nearly 50% of Ukrainians rejected the legitimacy of the post-coup government. This led to rebellions in parts of Ukraine that were ethnically and culturally close to Russia. In Crimea, a peninsula on the Black Sea with a mostly Russian-speaking population that was part of Russia from 1783 until 1954, as well as in the eastern provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk. In Odessa, 42 anti-coup protesters were burned to death by a mob on May 2nd, 2014. The new government in Ukraine was rejected by the parliament in Crimea, and a referendum to rejoin Russia passed overwhelmingly and was accepted by Russia but not recognized by other countries. The provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk also passed referendums declaring themselves independent from Ukraine, leading to a civil war that killed an estimated 14,000 people. Many Ukrainian military units based in this region defected to the self-declared People's Republics or refused to fight their own people. So the Ukrainian government formed new National Guard units to fight the separatists. These included units like the Azov Battalion, recruited from the same neo-Nazi groups that took up arms to spearhead the coup in Kiev in February 2014. The worst fighting of the Civil War ended in February 2015 with the signing of the Minsk II Accord. This was drafted by France, Germany, and Russia, and agreed to by Ukraine and the self-declared republics. It set up a ceasefire and a buffer zone between the warring parties and was monitored by 1,300 monitors and staff from the OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. While the ceasefire largely held from 2015 to 2022, Ukrainian government failed to implement the political aspects of the Minsk II agreement. It had agreed to grant Donetsk and Luhansk a new autonomous status, but each time the Ukrainian government tried to move forward on this, extreme right-wing forces re-exerted their power and insisted that Ukraine must instead keep fighting to recover its lost territories. NATO and the U.S. also bear responsibility for the failure of Minsk II. Despite officially claiming to support the agreement, NATO and the U.S., under both Trump and Biden, kept building up Ukraine's military, encouraging the Ukrainian government to believe it could eventually recover Donbass and Crimea by force, and that the U.S. and NATO would support that. As tensions were reaching a boiling point in December 2021, Russia took the initiative of drafting two mutual security treaties, one between Russia and the United States and the other between Russia and NATO. These were not take-it-or-leave-it demands, but drafts for negotiation. Unfortunately, the United States and NATO summarily dismissed Russia's proposals. By building up Ukraine's military, promising Ukraine NATO membership, and dismissing negotiations, the U.S. and its allies turned Ukraine into a dangerous weapon in their revived Cold War against Russia. Then, in the days leading up to February's Russia invasion, the OSCE ceasefire monitors documented thousands of explosions around the ceasefire line in Donbass, mostly on the Donetsk and Luhansk side, indicating a major escalation of artillery fire by Ukrainian government forces. So even in the immediate causes of the war, it is deceptive to describe the invasion as unprovoked, as Biden and U.S. officials routinely do. By early 2022, Russia had amassed large military forces near Belarus' border and its own borders with Ukraine, all the while denying that it had plans to invade. It also formally recognized Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics as independent countries. On February 24th, Russia invaded. The invasion was illegal on many counts. It was not an act of self-defense, and it certainly was not authorized by the United Nations. Under international law, including the Kellogg-Briand Pact and the UN Charter, the invasion was an illegal crime of aggression. Russia did not just move its invading forces into Donbass to support the breakaway republics, but it launched offensive towards the capital, Kyiv, and the second largest city, Kharkiv, in the northeast, and into the southern part of Ukraine from Crimea. Western analysts generally agree that Russia must have hoped to take quickly Kyiv and install a friendly government, but it encountered strong resistance from Ukrainian forces and was forced to withdraw from the north. Ukraine's western neighbors responded to the invasion by granting asylum to millions of refugees, while the U.S. and other NATO countries poured billions of dollars worth of weapons into Ukraine. stepped up their training of Ukrainian military, and provided it with intelligence to accurately attack important Russian targets. There has been little or no accountability for the weapons flooding into Ukraine. There are reports that as little as 30% of them may be reaching the front lines because they are either destroyed by Russian missiles or siphoned off into the black market, where they could end up in the hands of the Islamic State, neo-Nazis, or other dangerous groups around the world. This was precisely why the U.S. Congress prohibited the transfer of U.S. weapons to the Azov Regiment in 2018, as it became a magnet and a hub for international right-wing militant networks. Yet after the Russian invasion, all restraints were lifted, and thousands of tons of powerful and advanced weapons have poured in over the Polish border. There was so little debate about this in the U.S. that when Congress passed an enormous $40 billion package for Ukraine, with most of the money to be spent on more and more lethal weapons for up to another decade, not a single Democrat voted against it. Not even Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who cast the lone, wise, and prophetic vote against the disastrous war in Afghanistan in 2001. In our book, we explain the peace negotiations in Turkey in March that could have already ended this war, and the largely unreported role of the U.S. and British governments in killing those talks. The talks during the first month of the war produced the contours of a 15-point peace plan for a ceasefire, a Russia withdrawal, and a future for Ukraine as an independent, peaceful, and neutral country. On March 27th, President Zelensky told a national TV audience, "Our goal is obvious: peace and the restoration of normal life in our native state as soon as possible." Under the draft agreement, Ukraine would neither be a military ally of the United States and NATO, nor of Russia, with no foreign military bases or installations on its territory. Ukraine would get security guarantees from other countries. Russian speakers in Ukraine would be free to speak, read, and study in Russian. And the future of Crimea and Donbass would be determined by an internationally accepted political process during a transition period of several years. But none of that came to pass. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson went to Kyiv on April 9th and told Prime Minister Zelensky that the UK would not be party to any agreement between Ukraine and Russia, and that the collective West, as he called it, saw a chance to press Russia and was determined to make the most of it. Turkish diplomats who had been mediating the ceasefire talks reported that U.S. Defense Secretary Austin delivered a similar message to Zelensky, and that these messages effectively killed their peace efforts. So early hopes for a negotiated peace were dashed, largely as a result of U.S. and British determination to weaken Russia, even at the cost of rivers of Ukrainian blood, in an open-ended war that could last for years. The undermining of ceasefire talks was a tragic lost opportunity. Since the talks were abandoned, the slaughter and destruction has continued, with hundreds of Ukrainians killed every day. Russia has taken control of more territory, and despite the successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, Russia now occupies 20% of Ukraine. The sanctions against Russia have backfired, leading to soaring energy prices worldwide, while reduced grain exports have led to widespread hunger, particularly in the global south. Europe is facing an energy and home heating crisis. Meanwhile, no sign has honestly or publicly explained what its goals are in this war, or why they can possibly justify the total destruction of Ukraine and even the greater danger of nuclear war. Even the old war hawk Henry Kissinger is warning that U.S. policy has blundered to the brink of a world war, with no clear purpose or endgame in sight. He told the Wall Street Journal, "We are at the edge of war with Russia and China on issues which we partly created, without any concept of how this is going to end or what it's supposed to lead to. And here at home, we are told we don't have the funds for a decent healthcare system, or free college education, or housing for the unhoused. We cannot allow our public funds to be squandered on yet another unwinnable war and an even more all-consuming military budget. Governments in the global south are watching the impacts of this war plunge millions of their people into hunger and famine, while Europe's energy crisis is already sinking the continent into a recession. We in the U.S. have been relatively unscathed by this war compared to many people elsewhere, but we are already facing rising prices which will get worse as the war continues, and the U.S. will not be exempt from the impacts of this looming global recession. With climate chaos jeopardizing the very future of life on this planet, this war is derailing our efforts to confront the climate crisis. Instead of a Green New Deal, we are now watching a mad scramble to produce more oil, gas, and coal as energy companies reap record profits from their disaster capitalism. And while the climate heats up and governments and corporations shift their already inadequate climate plans into reverse, Russia and the U.S. are threatening us with yet another existential disaster, a nuclear apocalypse. We understand that some people may disagree with our analysis of this conflict, but hopefully we can all agree that we must do whatever we can to bring this war to an end. And that's why Code Pink is part of a coalition called Peace in Ukraine. We pressure our members of Congress and the White House to call for negotiations. We call on the media to promote the voice of peacemakers. We distribute our messages via social media, and we educate the public, including getting our book into libraries and classrooms. And we encourage you to join us. We must act now to say, stop the bloodshed, stop the bombing, stop the madness. We must work together to demand a ceasefire and negotiations, not more war. Thank you.
Phyllis's visit here is much, much more economical. So contribute what you can.
Yeah, that's definitely a good argument there for supporting this. Ah, so we made the video presentation so we can just give everybody um clear picture of just a summary of our book. I hope you will all read the book. It's only 200 pages, and it goes into all these aspects of the crisis in in more detail without without being too long or too in depth or too into the weeds. So really, I think I'd just like to open this up to questions now. We have another microphone. Do you wanna- So, okay.
One of my big concerns in relation to all of this, as well as other wars, is the lack of what I see as in depth journalistic, particularly electronic journalistic coverage of what is really going on. And I wondered if you could talk about, do you see any responsible electronic or print voices trying to bring accurate information about how this occurred? Is this happening at all? And would you like to either condemn or condone or lift up any particular print or electronic voices in relation to this situation?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there certainly um, are some good voices speaking out. I wouldn't say it's necessarily any particular outlets. Um, but for instance, tomorrow night, Code Pink is having their weekly Code Pink Congress call, and which you can find on the Code Pink website, or just Google Code Pink Congress. Those are hosted by Marcy Winograd. Um, and her guests tomorrow night are two people who have been eloquently, clearly speaking out about this. And one of them is former US Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Chaz Freeman. And the other is Columbia University professor Jeffrey Sachs. And both of those have been writing and speaking clearly about this whole situation. And so, yeah, I invite you all to tune in tomorrow night to Code Ping. I believe it would be maybe 7 p.m. Central Time, but you know you can Google it and figure it out. Um, Otherwise, I would say just that the usual places on alternative media. Democracy Now! Occasionally has good guests talking about this. Common Dreams has carried good articles. Um, Responsible Statecraft sometimes. There's a guy called Anatol Lieven, he's a bit of a militarist, but in his analysis of what's happening is pretty good. Um, it's really quite shameful that the US so-called mainstream media have just so uniformly parroted what amounts to propaganda. In fact, we have a chapter in the book titled "Information Warfare," and it begins with Chaz Freeman. Hold on a second. Chaz Freeman saying, "This war in Ukraine is the most intense information war humanity has ever seen. There are so many lies flying about that it's totally impossible to perceive the truth." And then he actually ended that interview saying, if you own a television, the best thing you can do is turn it off. So, yeah, it's probably a bit of an inadequate answer, but there certainly are some good voices out there. Um, so, okay, next.
Hi. I heard you on KKFI this morning, and I was going to call in then, but there wasn't space, so I'm going to ask you the question now. First off, thank you for writing the book. My book club is reading it, and I'm sure we're going to have a really exciting discussion of it next Sunday. But I'm about two-thirds of the way through, so I may have missed the punchline, but I'd like your opinion on this. Um, what's in it for the U.S. to carry on, to provoke and then carry on the armament of this war? Is it the Cold Warriors who are, like finding their new cause, or extending it? Is it the military industrial complex? What, in your opinion, is driving this thing from the US point of view?
Well, I'd say it's all those things. I would say the military industrial complex writ large, which would include NATO and all these Cold War institutions that sort of reinvented themselves in the 1990s and have in fact, gone on to become really maybe even more dominant than they were in the Cold War. Um, I mean, in terms of US-Russian relations since the end of the Cold War, um, the peace dividend was quickly trumped by uh, what's being called a power dividend. In other words, instead of taking the opportunity to make peace and reinvest in making life better for Americans and other people around the world, um, instead they really came up with new justifications for U.S. militarism. Um, you know, Humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect, and then the neocons who really came to dominate U.S. foreign policy now since the Bush administration, um, really, really just believe in the US being a military power and projecting its power through force and coercion on countries all over the world. They felt they had got such a high from that unipolar moment when our enemy unilaterally disarmed, basically, under Gorbachev, who was a genuine peacemaker. Um, that, that the U.S. has found it very hard to, and any subsequent administration has found it very hard to sort of fess up with the American people and and admit that that this has not worked. We are not at this moment the greatest country in the world. We are not looking at a new American century, as the neocons called it. We have acted for the last 25 years like a bull in a china shop, smashing anybody and anything that got in our way. And in the belief that nobody could stand in our way. In the meantime, China has developed economically. They they focused on their own economic development. According to the World Bank, they lifted 800 million people out of poverty. It's an unprecedented miracle. And yet, little by little, from one administration to the next, as they sort of figured out ways to do it and ways to present it to us, um, they have they have started what some people call a new Cold War, but what I really prefer to look at it as reviving the old Cold War, because what's the difference? And so um, after Trump came along, under his Secretary of Defense, Mad Dog Mattis, who said it can be fun to kill some people, um, they in 2018 they published a new national defense strategy for the United States that declared that the main focus of US military policy would now be the peer competition, the, the great power competition with Russia and China. In other words, the war on terror had served its purpose. It had justified dropping over 300,000 bombs and missiles on 9 poor countries that really couldn't defend themselves, and killing probably, I mean, by my estimate, I mean millions of people. something in the order of 5 or 6 million people. And so, uh, so, so people, the mainstream narrative here amongst our politicians and media, who really have not come to terms with the reality of any of that, um, claim that this is all sort of, the fact that NATO or the US would be a threat to Russia is all just some sort of fantasy. But, we only have to look at how the US has behaved in the world. And NATO has been deeply involved in that, as we said in the video. There was the attack on Kosovo in 1999. NATO was deeply involved in Afghanistan for 20 years, and then really, completely, completely destabilized Libya, which is, really just chaos to this day, and launched a covert attack on Syria in alliance with jihadi forces who pledged allegiance to Al Qaeda. In other words, we went in 10 years from Al Qaeda being the great threat to us, the great enemy, to actually using them to attack Syria. And that then spawned ISIS, and that led to an, the greatest, the heaviest US bombing of the last 25 years, when they dropped over 100,000 bombs and missiles on Iraq and Syria in the war against ISIS. Uh, Donald Trump said that we should, when we go after these terrorists, we should get their families too. And when the Iraqi military finally made it into the old city of Mosul, the smoking ruins and rubble from those tens of thousands of bombs dropped on the city, and HIMARS rockets from the US Marines, Rocket City, as they called it, outside Mosul. Um, the Iraqi forces just massacred anyone who was left alive. So they fulfilled Trump's threat to take out the women and children. And so, um, why would Russia not be afraid of this growing threat of NATO, uh, surrounding it with the most dangerous, most heavily armed military alliance in history? Um, so that's that, and the complete arrogance of assuming Russia could never, you know, really just had to lump it and accept NATO expansion and couldn't do anything about it. Finally, after years of pleading with the US to discuss these issues and negotiate a security agreement that provided security to all sides, not just to one side. Finally, yes, Russia invaded Ukraine, and we're completely unequivocal in the book that is a crime of aggression, because the whole point of the UN Charter is that no one is supposed to do that, no matter how great the provocation. But to call it unprovoked is just really a sort of sick joke, really, because from the coup in 2014 to NATO expansion, to all the US aggression around the world, we conclude that this was definitely not unprovoked, although it is illegal and criminal. So,
Just a fast question. In the movie, I saw that they were saying after 100 days of that war, which started this last spring, Russia had occupied 20% of Ukraine. Do you have any figures for what it is now?
it's still over 20%. It was well over 20% for a while, because uh, Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure. I never heard a percentage at the point where of maximum occupation, but it is still over 20%.
Nicholas, thank you for being with us. You do say at the beginning that this is not defensible, the acts that have taken place by Russia, but many people would perceive this book as being defensive of Russia. And we all remember the appeasement that the US and England and so forth did to Adolf Hitler. And he took, one step, to the next. And I think that many Americans feel we cannot negotiate with this person. I mean, you look at the facts today, and Putin, I'm saying, is targeting civilians. He's targeting buildings, he's targeting utilities. Putin would have a chance right now to call a freeze, just leave it as it is. And I think that we will never get a peace with just the two parties coming to some resolution. I think it's like an arbitration where the power of the arbitrator makes the decision, not the two parties, because they are so um, you know advocates for their own position. And, you speak about NATO growing. Well, a long time ago, it was just 15 countries. But I think NATO has grown since 2014 and more recent years. Finland, Sweden, and those would not have joined NATO had not Russia taken these actions. I see Putin as a terrible chess player.
Yeah, it's quite an irony that in response to NATO expansion, Russia has now triggered even greater expansion of NATO. So yeah, I mean that certainly that certainly was not a good chess move by any stretch. Um, as far as I think it's important to understand that for Russia, this is not all about Putin. Um, we have a bad habit, I think, in this country of personalizing these things. We do it in the domestic politics, and um, and we also apply it to foreign policy in a way. It's much easier to gin up hatred uh, and to demonize a person than a country. Um, but in fact, let me just read a couple of things that I think illustrate this. When NATO began expanding in the 1990s, none of us had ever heard of Vladimir Putin. I think at that point he was probably the mayor of St. Petersburg or something. However, when President Clinton was considering offering NATO membership to Hungary, Czech Republic, and Poland, 50 prominent US foreign policy experts, many of them who had been senior US officials during the Cold War with Russia, many had a pretty good understanding about Russia. And they wrote an open letter to President Clinton urging him not to expand NATO. And they said it would be a policy error of historic proportions that would unsettle European stability. Um, George Kennan gave an interview to the New York Times. He's known as the intellectual godfather of the containment policy of the Cold War. And he warned that NATO expansion was the beginning of a new Cold War. This is when in 1998, we'd only just finished the previous one. And he said, quote, "I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. Um, and William Burns, our present CIA director, who was a political officer at the embassy in Washington, he said in a report back to the State Department that hostility to early NATO expansion is almost universally felt across the domestic political spectrum here. And when it came to in 2008 to telling NATO they were going, I'm telling Ukraine that they were going to be able to join NATO, William Burns was by then the US ambassador in Moscow, and he sent this message to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. He said, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. So, we successive administrations were warned, that what this could lead to, and what it has in fact led to. I mean, they were right. And as far as that we can't negotiate with Putin, well, Ukraine did negotiate with Russia, and they did very near come close to ending this after the first month of the war. And what has happened since is that Russia has taken more territory, and then it has lost some more recently. And now I think we are at another moment where we must really consider the possibility of negotiation. Exactly what form it will take, I don't know. Um, I think the fact that each side is now setting out these sort of maximalist demands, Russia is saying it'll never give back Kherson and Zaporizhia, the other two provinces it occupied, even though it just pulled out of Kherson, the main city of Kherson province. And then on the other hand, you've got Zelensky saying that we will not give up 1 inch of, our internationally recognized territory. But I think what you saw in March was revealing because it showed not their maximalist positions, but it actually showed what each of them was willing to settle for in order to have peace, as Zelensky told his people on national TV there. He told them that their goal was to, as quickly as possible, re-establish peace in their country. And he also told them what his red lines were for the negotiations, what he would not give up or not accept. And he also um, and he also said that the neutrality agreement, as he called it, would be submitted to a referendum of all the people of Ukraine before it could become a reality. And so how many thousands of lives would have been saved if they had been able to complete that? If the US and the UK had not instead promised him virtually limitless amounts of weapons and told him, assured him that we are in it for the long run. We, in our comfort here, with nobody dropping bombs on us or shooting at us. And so I think we are at another moment where peace can be achieved, and I think, and then another good piece of evidence for that is that General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had the guts to stick his neck out and say so when none of his civilian bosses would do so. He spoke to the Economic Club of New York and and said that this would this would be a good moment for a negotiated peace. And he said, if there is a chance for peace and negotiations, we have to take it. And and another thing is that we the propaganda on both sides has has drummed up support with the idea that our side can win. I mean, the Russians are doing that too. But how realistic is it for Ukraine to really defeat Russia to the point where Russia would just give up and go home? Um, let's move on to another question because I want to give people time. Yes, please.
Could you just provide more detail about the two agreements that you mentioned in the video that you're just now talking about? Like what was in those agreements and why did the U.S. not want them?
Okay, these are what the agreement I was talking about just now is the agreement after the invasion. Okay, in the video we were talking about two draft agreements that Russia presented to the US in like November and December before the invasion. Well, they were draft mutual security agreements, really citing, you know, a lot of the things that Russia had said before about how they were threatened by NATO, threatened by the fact that NATO has put nuclear capable missile launchers in Romania and Poland, um, and that and that it is arming Ukraine, and if Ukraine becomes a NATO member, and if NATO continues to expand, it will just threaten Russia even more from the Russian perspective. But I mean, there was one draft agreement with 9 points on it and one with 8. One was for an agreement with the US and one was for agreement with NATO. And and the US really refused to negotiate over any of that. There was a meeting between Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman and Foreign Secretary Sergei Lavrov. Um, but essentially, the Americans, just sort of came back with their own issues and didn't refuse to discuss the the points that Russia had made. Because it has refused, these are the same things it has been refusing to negotiate or discuss seriously with Russia since the end of the Cold War, really, since the honeymoon ended in the 1990s, and they started once again, expanding NATO and to the Russian way of looking at it, threatening Russia. I mean, this is a classic security dilemma. Each side says that it is only acting defensively. The countries who want to join NATO say, well, it's just because we're afraid of Russia and we want NATO's protection. Russia, on the other hand, looks at the way the US has behaved in the world and says we need and this NATO alliance sort of creeping up on its borders and says, we need our security to be assured. We need protection. And this is a classic security dilemma. What the actions that each side is taking that it considers defensive are then seen as a threat or aggressive by the other side. And unlike from the Cuban Missile Crisis and unlike the Cold War, the US has not been willing to sit down and actually work these things out with Russia. And finally, yeah, the string snapped, and now we have a war in Europe. Yes.
One thing that this does not seem to get mentioned, and I think it has a place, and that is the Russian experience in World War II and their experience there of being surrounded by the Axis powers and paying a tremendous price, much, much greater than any other country, especially including the U.S., although, most Americans think that the U.S. won the war, but it really didn't.
Mm.
And, you know, put the blame on Putin for this, I think, is overlooking that awareness. And most Russians have a father or grandfather who fought, and many died, defending the Soviet Union. So it just seems essential that be taken into account in the current situation.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Russia has had to defend itself against the West time and time again, from Napoleon to, after the revolution, Western forces, joined with the White Russians to fight, to try and defeat the Bolshevik Revolution. And then yes, the Germans, I mean, absolutely practically destroyed the Soviet Union and mass murdering not just Jews but anyone who they saw as likely to be a problem for their occupation of Ukraine, Poland, all these other countries. Um and yeah, and it was very largely the Russian military that fought back, that fought from near total defeat back to actually defeat the Germans. And the British and Americans kept putting off their D-Day, when they would finally land um, in Europe and actually contribute to the fighting on the ground. I mean, first they landed in Italy, then Normandy. But that had been, I mean, Britain had been at war with Germany for um, 4 years by the time any Allied troops landed in Italy, and the US had been at war with Germany for what, 2 years by then. So I mean, and the main landings in Normandy didn't happen until 1944. So I mean, who was doing all the fighting? Who was even then, even after D-Day, the bulk of the German army was desperately fighting the Soviets, and they lost. I'm not sure. I don't even remember what the numbers are. 20, 30, 40 million people. Okay, 27 is the official estimate. So yes, this is real history to Russia. I mean, we're here. I mean, Britain. I mean, okay, just one more sentence. I mean, yes, Britain was bombed during World War II. It was not invaded. There hasn't been a war on American soil really since the American Civil War. I mean, the Apache did not officially surrender until I think the 1920s, but but a real war in which Americans faced, American civilians faced hostile soldiers attacking the places where they lived. It hasn't happened for 150 years. So we have no conception of that really. So yes, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, I was under the impression that Putin wanted Ukraine to build his empire. So, is that true or not?
No, that's not true. First of all, first of all, this talk of the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire was built in the 18th and 19th centuries, and it has more in common with the westward expansion of the United States than the kind of empire that the US has today, or the kind of empire that Britain had when I was growing up. I grew up in the last outposts of the British Empire because my dad was a doctor in the Royal Navy. And yes, we had bases all around the world. None of them are there anymore. They're all gone. Because in almost every case, the country where they were didn't want them there anymore. Some I can't think of any bases I lived on that are now American. But yes, in a sense, the US took over that role of maintaining, a maritime empire with bases scattered all over the world. Russia has never had that. So when we use the word empire, it can mean different things. And there's a sort of Western interpretation of some things that Putin has said that people have claimed mean that he doesn't really recognize Ukraine as an independent country. When he talks about their common culture and things like that, common history, I mean that is all true, but that's not the same as saying I'm going to destroy this country as an independent political entity. He's never said that's what he wants to do. And in fact, as we say in the video, one of the problems with this war is that each side is putting out its propaganda, and no side, neither Russia nor Ukraine, nor the United States and NATO, has actually leveled with its own people and said, okay, well, this is what this war is about for us, and this is what we hope to achieve. This is our goal, and this is how it will end. They're all using um, false goals to generate support for what they are doing. And we at least as Americans, and me as a Briton, should be demanding more honesty from our leaders of why they are doing this. What is it all about? How is this supposed to end? Even Kissinger can see that they haven't figured that out. Yes.
So I don't want to be a question hog, but I got one last question.
Go for it. So,
Can you comment on the division of labor between you and Medea in writing this book? Who did what?
okay, our publisher gave us 2 months to write this book, May and June, and at least that's when we got the first draft finished. And we basically just each sort of start writing a chapter, and then when we got it finished, each got our chapters finished. We looked at each other's chapters, and went back and forth on them a bit, and basically, I mean. I I would say my main job was writing the first 3 chapters, which sort of tell the narrative going from 2014 to the Minsk agreement to the invasion. Meanwhile, Medea was writing the chapter on NATO and the one on information warfare and the Western sanctions. So that was sort of 3 chapters each. We worked together on the nuclear one, and we got some help from Alice Slater of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation on that. Um, and then really there's just the sort of introduction and the conclusion that we really did together. Um, so yeah, that was basically the division of labor.
So I have a couple questions before we finish. One,
Okay. Did you have one or you?
Take a few more questions and then end, and then Nicholas is going to be books.
oh, I forgot about the book signing. Yeah, I'll try to make it
Okay.
quick.
Okay.
Okay. The first thing is the role of the democracy promotion with National Endowment for Democracy, U.S. Institute for Peace, and all these
You know,
different.
that's my phone. Let me just silence it. I'm sorry. All right, it stopped. Okay.
And so these organizations were created in 1984, mostly right before the Iran Contra event, and
I'm
they've
sorry,
gone
which organizations?
National Endowment for Democracy, the
Oh, okay.
United
Right,
States
right.
Institute for Peace, and there's like 30
Yeah,
or 40 associated organizations, not only in the U.S. but in different European countries. They have think tanks. It's an industry,
right.
a democracy promotion industry, and apparently there was a Senate investigation in 2006 by Richard Lugar. They sent people all around the world. And at that point, Vladimir Putin had shut down some of these NGOs because he said, you know, it sounds like you're doing a good thing, but you're actually trying to undermine my government. And he said something similar at the 2007 Munich Peace Conference, or Munich Security Conference. I mean, he said, hey, your democracy promotion looks a lot to me like you're trying to change my regime. And Xi Jinping has said something similar. Both Russia and China have said your attempt to spread democracy around the world is undermining our ability to maintain order. So I wanted you to comment on that if you could.
Yeah, sure. I mean, part of the problem with, there's a problem with a lot of these words we use, like democracy, because people, it means different things to different people in different countries. But so, yeah, even calling this democracy promotion, I mean, well, it's, I mean, I would say we should just remember how people reacted here to the accusation that Russia was trying to interfere in our political system and our elections. I mean, and yet the US does it all over the world, and then sort of and claims that it's actually a good thing. So um, it, somehow we have to get it through to our representatives and leaders that um, that we want them to respect other people in other countries and allow and to, as the UN Charter requires, to not interfere in the internal politics of other countries. If if we were such a great example, more other countries would want to follow us. And in fact, that used to be the case for a long time. The US held itself up as a beacon of democracy, and many other countries followed that. I mean, um, in Western Europe, all our allies in Western Europe accepted a US leadership role after World War II. Some more than others, and it was certainly wasn't universal. But I mean, we don't want other countries coming and telling us how to run our country. And guess what? Other people are just like us. They don't want they're the same. They don't want they don't want the US coming and interfering in how they run their country. And that's not just the leaders, the evil leaders who our government doesn't like. It's it's across the board. Yes.
I hear you making a strong call for us to get active with Code Pink in the. I hear you making the strong call for us to get active with Code Pink in the congressional contacts. That is sometimes overwhelming to us from a heavily conservative area of the country, but I hear that it has to be done. I also know in this room are people with many years of work for some sanity through Citizens for Justice in the Middle East and experiences of our Vets for Peace in the local area. And we also know that the Nevada Desert experience, which was first oriented toward nuclear weapons, now heavily focusing on drones. And some of us locals go to Whiteman Air Force Base in the heart of Missouri, a ways over, an hour and a half drive, to say, stop conducting drone warfare from Whiteman. And it's just truly pretty overwhelming. I encourage everybody here to stop for tabling with Code Pink over here, with Vets for Peace and Peaceworks back here. And Nicholas, we could convince to sign books for people who bought the books earlier. And also, I think a representative from Willa's Books may be here. Willa's Books is where the book is for sale in Kansas City on Troost.
I was there this afternoon. I'm not sure that they actually had any.
They didn't have it. Okay, we have it.
Right, right. Okay. So yeah. So I mean, is are people here going to get some books too, Willa's books, or?
Some people probably bought books that you need to have you.
Yes, no, absolutely, sure. Okay, all right. So,
I have
all right. Um,
yeah, just
yes,
one, and
sorry.
I guess what I'm trying to grasp is, was it a good thing when the Soviet Union broke up and people, I thought those countries were happy that they were no longer affiliated with the Soviet Union. And that's part of what I thought Putin's problem was, that he was mad that all those countries decided they didn't want to be part of the Soviet Union. So I'm trying to figure that
Yeah,
how.
he wasn't in charge when that happened. That was
Right. So,
Gorbachev.
but I know he wasn't in charge, but that has been always, as I understand it, reading nothing terribly, academic, but I mean, it's just what I always understood is that was one of his goals. And yet
Well,
those
again,
people didn't want
that's
to be part of the Soviet Union, those countries.
right, right.
So what are we doing here? I'm not sure I understand. I guess I'm confused.
Yeah, well, but that's because you've heard.
I mean, the people in Ukraine have a right to say we don't want to be part of the Soviet Union. Was that a bad thing?
No, absolutely. And the Soviet Union no longer exists. And
Okay.
I mean, I think what you've heard is, as I told someone else, is efforts by U.S. politicians and corporate media to, you know, to 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 put motives and uh, goals in Putin's head that he has not declared himself.
I mean, I guess if, let's say, the negotiation table, it happens and they say, okay, let's go to the table. Is he going to allow the current government to stand?
Well,
Zelensky, is he still going to be in power, or is he going to be taken off
yeah,
and
no, no,
shot
I mean, it's
someplace?
actually Zelensky saying that he won't negotiate until Putin is removed. It's the other way around.
Okay.
But in March, I think what we saw was both sides coming to put on the table what they would actually accept, not their maximum demands, but their minimum demands, what it would take to get them to stop fighting, to get the Russians to withdraw from Ukraine, to get Ukraine to agree to a neutral position between the East and West. I mean, Ukraine could be a connection between East and West, a bridge between East and West. And instead, it's a battlefield between East and West. And the only way it's going to go from being a battlefield to being, a peaceful, neutral country that can actually maybe connect us, is through diplomacy and peaceful negotiations. And it is also important for the US and NATO on one hand and Russia on the other to negotiate our larger differences. But I think the urgency right now is to get to a ceasefire a ceasefire that will hold because both sides have accepted it. And you know, it that's how that's how diplomacy works. That's how negotiation works. As the saying goes, you don't negotiate with your friends, you negotiate with your enemies. So it's given that they are enemies, but that's precisely why they need to negotiate.
Could you address one more thing before
I
we
think
go?
we're
And
running
then,
out of time
okay,
here.
well, let me go ahead and ask it really quick. And that's the perception of arrogance. To get to your question, many, after the Cold War, both Russians and Americans were perceived as being extremely arrogant overseas. And that's kind of what the hatred's all about. That's why a lot of the world hates Americans. That's why a lot of the world hates Russians. And so that's an issue that also kind of backs up a lot of this is you have all these Eastern European countries that really don't want to be dominated by Russians nor by Americans. So anyway.
Yeah.
Well, Nicholas, thank you so much for your talk. And you will be signing books.
Okay. I'll be in the back of the room signing books. Thank you all for jumping. Yeah, you just push. You have to push. You have to hold it in.